Being the black sheep isn't something you choose. It's a role you're assigned, a heavy coat handed to you at birth that you can never seem to take off, no matter how warm the room gets. In my family, the air was always a little colder for me. It wasn't about loud arguments or dramatic fights. It was about the silence. A silence that fell whenever I shared a dream that didn't align with their practical, rigid blueprint for life. My father, a man who measured worth in spreadsheets and profit margins, saw my passion for creative writing as a liability. My mother, who valued appearances above all else, viewed my introverted nature as a social failing, a stain on the perfect family portrait she worked so hard to paint. My older brother James was the golden child, the son their world revolved around. Every minor achievement of his was celebrated like a festival, while my academic awards received a quiet, dismissive nod, as if my success was just an inconvenient fluke. I learned to navigate the unspoken rules. Don't be too loud, don't have a different opinion, and whatever you do, don't draw attention away from James. I remember when I was 16 and won a citywide poetry contest. The prize was a small scholarship and a publication in a local journal. When I told them, my father glanced up from his newspaper and said, "Poetry? How's that going to pay the bills?" My mother gave me a tight smile. "That's nice, dear," she said softly, "but let's not make a big deal out of it. Your brother has his final football game this week, and we need to focus our energy on supporting him." And just like that, my victory was packed away, stored in the attic of my heart, alongside countless other moments that taught me my light was meant to stay dim. I became a ghost at my own family's table, an expert at taking up less space, at swallowing my words until they tasted like ash. I foolishly believed that if I just kept trying, if I just became what they wanted, maybe one day they'd finally see me. That hope was dangerous. A flickering candle I carried into the darkest rooms, unaware they were the ones creating the wind that threatened to snuff it out. I should have seen it coming. I should have known every gathering was just another test I was destined to fail. The restaurant was beautiful. White tablecloths, softly clinking crystal, everything pristine. It was my grandparents' 50th anniversary, meant to be a celebration of family unity and enduring love. For me, it felt like walking into a carefully set trap. I played my part, wore a modest dress, smiled at jokes I didn't find funny, kept my voice soft and unobtrusive. I could feel their eyes on me all night, a silent jury passing judgment on my every move. The tension at our table was alive, tightening with every forced laugh. The breaking point didn't come with a crash, but a question. My uncle, who always liked to stir things up, turned to my father. "So," he said, voice a little too loud, "how's the business holding up? I heard things have been rough." A hush fell over our side of the room. My father's strained politeness dropped, and his face flushed deep red. But he didn't look at his brother. He looked straight at me. His finger shot out, pointing, and the whole table followed his gaze. "The business," he said, his voice seething, "was fine, until she got her hands on it." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and choking. Her modern ideas, her creative strategies, she drove away loyal customers. She took a legacy we built over generations and treated it like one of her worthless little art projects. It was a tidal wave of blame, and the rest of my family were the currents dragging me under. "She's always thought she was better than us," my brother sneered. "Always has." My mother didn't look angry, just profoundly, soul-crushingly disappointed. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" she whispered. "You always have to make everything about you." I opened my mouth to defend myself, to bring up the facts, the data, the nights I spent trying to save them from their own bad decisions. But what was the point? This wasn't a trial. I had been found guilty long before I walked through the door. The truth was just another inconvenience they had no room for. My father stood up, his chair scraping the floor. "You've ruined this family," he spat. "Get out! I don't want to see your face. Get out!" I looked to my mother, my eyes silently pleading. She wouldn't meet my gaze. She stared at her folded napkin and whispered the one word that finally broke me. "Go." Something shifted inside me in that moment. The desperate need to please, the lifelong hunger for their approval, it all just disappeared. What replaced it was a sudden, strange calm, a clarity so sharp it hurt. I was done. Outside, the world blurred past in hazy lights and muted colors. Inside my car, it was silent. I wasn't crying. The rage and hurt had cooled into something colder, surgical, focused. I didn't drive to my apartment. I drove to the house I grew up in, the stage for all my quiet heartbreaks. I knew they'd be out for at least another hour. This wasn't an escape. It was an amputation. The key was cold in my hand as I let myself in for the last time. The house was quiet. Still. Each piece of furniture a silent witness to years of me pretending to be someone I wasn't. I passed the family photos on the wall, smiling faces that now looked like strangers, and went straight to my old room. I packed quickly, with quiet efficiency. I didn't take much. I left behind the clothes my mother approved of, the books they called appropriate, the gifts that always felt like obligations. Those things weren't mine. They were props for a character I wasn't willing to play anymore. I took the worn-out novels that had been my only true friends. I took a few outfits I'd bought with my own money. I took the journals I'd hidden in my closet, pages filled with words I was never allowed to say. Each item I placed in that single suitcase was a piece of my real self I was finally reclaiming. On my nightstand, there was a photo of a younger me, smiling between my siblings. A dull ache spread through my chest, a grief for the girl in that picture, who tried so hard to earn a love that was always conditional. I left the photo face down. When the suitcase was full, I walked back downstairs. There was no note, no grand explanation. They didn't deserve my words. They had proven they wouldn't listen anyway. My silence would be my final statement. On the polished wood of the kitchen table, where we'd had so many tense family breakfasts, I placed my house key, a small, shiny object that marked a definitive end. I closed the front door behind me, the soft click of the latch the only sound in the night. It felt like sealing a tomb. As I got back into my car and pulled away from the curb, I didn't look back. I just drove, heading for the highway, away from the only home I had ever known. I had no destination, no plan, just the overwhelming, terrifying, and exhilarating certainty that I was finally, truly on my own. The highway eventually blurred into the flickering neon of a roadside motel. That first night, in a sterile room that smelled of bleach and loneliness, the dam finally broke. The calm that had carried me out of the restaurant shattered, and I was consumed by a tidal wave of grief. A raw, physical ache for a family I was slowly realizing I had never truly had. The silence from my phone was the most brutal confirmation. Days turned into weeks. No missed calls, no angry texts, no messages asking if I was safe. It was as if I had simply vanished and no one had noticed the empty space I left behind. The first few months were a masterclass in survival. My savings were laughable, a flimsy cushion against harsh reality. I traded my dreams for a waitress's apron at a dingy 24-hour diner. My life shrank to the grueling rhythm of double shifts and cheap instant coffee. My hands, which once held paintbrushes, were now chapped and sore from carrying hot plates. My mind, once alive with stories, became a mental ledger of coffee orders and side dishes. I was exhausted, invisible, profoundly alone. There were moments, late at night in my tiny rented room, when doubt crept in, whispering that I had made a terrible mistake, that I should have just stayed and endured it. The loneliness was a physical presence, especially on holidays or my birthday, which passed without a single acknowledgement. But in that crushing solitude, something unexpected began to grow. With no one to criticize me, to dismiss my thoughts, or call my passions worthless, my own voice started to emerge from the silence. Faint at first, a whisper beneath the noise of fear. One rainy afternoon, after a brutal shift, I found myself unpacking the one box of personal things I'd brought with me. At the bottom, under old journals, were my art supplies. My fingers trembled as I picked up a charcoal pencil. It had been years. With no goal in mind, no intention of creating anything great, I just started to sketch. I drew exhaustion. I drew flickering hope. I drew the city skyline outside my window. It wasn't for anyone else. It was for me. A small, quiet act in a lonely room, but it felt like the first real breath I'd taken in years. I didn't know it then, but in that room, surrounded by the ghosts of my past, I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was planting the first seed of a new life. That tiny spark of creativity became a lifeline. Art wasn't a hobby anymore. It was how I breathed. After draining shifts at the diner, I'd come home and pour every unsaid word, every simmering emotion, every fragile hope onto cheap canvases and into sketchbooks. I painted the tired faces of my late-night customers. I sketched the quiet dignity of old buildings in the city. I was telling my story in charcoal and paint, a story I had never been allowed to voice. And in doing so, I was healing parts of myself I didn't even know were broken. I started bringing my sketchbook to work, filling the slow hours during breaks. One afternoon, Maria, the diner's owner, a tough, warm woman in her 60s, caught me drawing. She watched silently over my shoulder. I instinctively tried to hide the page, years of conditioning bracing me for criticism. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice unexpectedly kind. "I've got a big, ugly, empty wall by the entrance, been bothering me for years." She pointed with her chin. "Frame a few of those. Hang them up. If one sells, you buy me a cup of coffee. Deal?" My heart pounded with familiar terror. To put my art on display, to show my soul like that, it felt like walking back into my family's living room. My father's voice calling my passion useless. My brother calling me an attention seeker echoed in my head. But Maria's offer wasn't judgment. It was a chance. So I took the leap. I spent what little tip money I had on secondhand frames and, with trembling hands, hung 4 of my most personal pieces on that wall. For a week I couldn't even look at them, convinced they were embarrassing. Then one day, a tourist, just passing through, stood in front of one sketch for a full 10 minutes. It was a simple drawing, a lone bird on a wire against a stormy sky. "This," she said, turning to me with tears in her eyes, "this is how I feel." She didn't just buy it, she asked if I had more. That moment, the crinkle of cash in my hand, meant more than money. It was validation, proof that my perspective, the very thing my family tried to crush, wasn't just real. It mattered. It could reach someone else. It could connect. That night, I went home and, for the first time, I didn't just see a struggling waitress in the mirror. I saw an artist. That single moment of validation became my fuel. The next year was a blur of relentless, solitary work. I lived a double life, 12-hour shifts at the diner to pay for my tiny room and my art supplies, followed by long, sleepless nights pouring every ounce of energy I had left onto canvas. My little corner at the diner became a rotating gallery, and slowly, word began to spread. It wasn't just about the art, it was the story behind it, the raw emotion people saw in the lines and shadows. With trembling hands, I created an anonymous social media account to post my work. No name, no face, just the art. I was terrified, but the fear of staying invisible had finally become greater than the fear of being seen. For months, growth came slowly. A few dozen followers, a kind comment, a small sale through a DM. Then a local art blogger published a short piece calling me the city's best-kept secret. That article lit a spark. The trickle turned into a steady stream, then a flood. Commission requests started filling my inbox. People were connecting to my story, my pain, my resilience, my hope, through the art. The day I walked into the diner and told Maria I could finally quit to pursue my art full-time, we both stood behind the counter and cried. I moved out of my dingy little room and into a studio apartment, small, bright, and filled with the smell of paint. It wasn't just a financial shift. It was a transformation. I was no longer just surviving. I was building something. With every piece I sold, every message from someone who felt seen by my work, I reclaimed a little more of the confidence my family had tried to erase. I stood a little taller. The defensive tension in my shoulders eased. I was becoming the woman I was always meant to be, far from the critical eyes and suffocating expectations of my past. And through that entire year of seismic change, the silence from my family was absolute. Not one call, not one message. It was the confirmation I needed. My new life was truly, completely my own, built from the ashes of who I used to be. I thought that part of my life was over, but the past rarely stays buried forever. My new life felt like a fortress, brick by brick, I had built it with my own hands. It was my sanctuary, my world, and the ghosts of my past stayed locked outside the gates. But success is a strange thing. It doesn't just elevate you, it stretches your world until it touches places you tried to leave behind. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, thick, creamy cardstock that felt alien in my paint-stained hands. The annual Heritage Foundation Gala, one of the city's most prestigious charity events. A piece of my art, a large, deeply personal painting, had been chosen as the centerpiece of the live auction. It was an honor that made my head spin, the kind of recognition I'd only dared to dream about. My first instinct was to refuse. My stomach dropped. A gala, a playground for the city's elite, the exact kind of event where my mother would be, draped in jewelry and fake smiles, curating the family's pristine image. Just the thought of seeing them again, of feeling those judgmental eyes, was enough to send my heart racing. I called Maria, who had become my fiercest ally. "I can't go," I whispered, the fear choking my throat. "Then they win," she said, her voice firm but kind. "They took your past. Don't let them steal your future too. This night isn't about them. It's about your work, about everything you've built since the day you walked away. Go, and hold your head high." She was right. Hiding would be surrender. This wasn't about chasing their approval. It was about not running from my own success. I would go, for me. Preparing felt like suiting up for battle. I didn't buy a safe, neutral dress. I bought a gown in deep sapphire blue, the color of the midnight sky I drove into the night I left. It was bold. It was unapologetic. It was everything they told me not to be. As the taxi pulled up to the grand ballroom, lit up like a fairy tale, I took a deep breath. I knew they'd be there. I could feel it. This was their world, their stage. But tonight, for the first time, I wasn't an outsider. I was a featured artist. I was the reason they were gathering. Walking into the ballroom felt like diving into ice water. The chandeliers, the laughter, the clinking glasses, it was overwhelming. For a heartbeat, I was that little girl again, in the wrong dress, saying the wrong thing. The instinct to shrink, to vanish into a dark corner, was strong. But then Clara, my agent, appeared at my side, a steadying, warm force. "There she is," she beamed, "the woman of the hour." She pulled me into conversation after conversation with critics and patrons, people whose names I'd only seen in magazines. They didn't see a former waitress. They saw the artist. They talked about my work with insight, respect, and genuine admiration. Each word was a shield, every compliment a piece of armor against the ghosts I knew were somewhere in that room. And then I saw them. Across the room, they stood like they belonged there, elegant, polished, and perfectly composed. My father, stern and important. My mother, graceful and smiling, but with that familiar tension around her eyes. My brother, practically his clone, confident and smug. They were laughing with a state senator. It was like watching a scene from a life I had set on fire. And then, mid-laugh, my mother's eyes swept the room and landed on me. The smile on her face didn't just fade, it shattered. I watched her hand fly to her pearl necklace, a nervous habit I knew all too well. She nudged my father, subtle but urgent, and his eyes followed hers. The look on his face was pure, unfiltered disbelief, like he was seeing a ghost. Then it twisted into something darker, more familiar. Anger. My brother just stared, his mouth slightly open. I could see the calculations in their eyes, the scrambling to understand what they were seeing, because they weren't seeing the family disappointment anymore. They were seeing a woman in a sapphire gown, standing confidently among the city's elite, treated not as an outcast, but as a guest of honor. The dissonance was like a visible tremor rolling across their faces. In that moment, a year of pain and struggle crystallized into a cold, calm surge of power. I didn't look away. I didn't smile or wave. I held their stunned gazes, gave them the smallest, most deliberate nod of acknowledgement, and then I turned away, smiling at something the person next to me said. The room's hum shifted as the lights dimmed, and all eyes turned toward the stage where my painting was now bathed in light. The ballroom fell silent as a spotlight illuminated the canvas, its colors and textures pulsing with life. This was a piece born of my darkest nights, and now It was the centerpiece of this glittering world. The auctioneer began to speak, weaving a story with his voice. He spoke of unflinching emotional honesty, of a raw talent that's both heartbreaking and hopeful. I watched my family from across the room. They wore the expressions of detached art lovers, likely judging the piece, assigning it value, completely oblivious to the fact that they were looking at the soul they had tried to discard. The irony hit like a punch to the chest. They were preparing to appraise the wreckage they had helped create. The artist, the auctioneer's voice boomed, his tone rising with drama, is a testament to the power of resilience. She is a powerful new voice in our city, and it is my absolute honor to introduce her to you tonight. He paused, letting the anticipation settle like dust in a sunbeam. Ladies and gentlemen, the creator of the unspoken, Miss Sarah Jenkins. My name, spoken with pride, echoing through a now breathless room. No longer a name whispered in disappointment, but one celebrated, announced with honor. A wave of applause broke out. The spotlight found me, and suddenly, under its brilliance, I could see every face in the room with perfect clarity. My mother's expression was pure horror, like the air had been knocked out of her. My father, so used to being in control, looked lost, pale, like someone had yanked the ground out from under him. My brother's smugness had vanished, replaced by the slack-jawed disbelief of someone who had just seen the impossible. Their story, where I was the failure, the black sheep, had just been dismantled in front of everyone. Someone nudged my arm. I realized I was supposed to move. I walked toward the stage, my path taking me just feet from their table. I looked each of them in the eye, not with gloating, not with vengeance, but with calm, quiet serenity, something they had never allowed me to have. I reached the stage, took the microphone from the auctioneer, and turned to face the room. I took a breath. The silence was a canvas. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "Thank you to the foundation for this incredible honor." My gaze moved across the room, intentionally passing over my family's table. This painting is about what grows in the dark, about the strength you discover when all you have left is yourself. It's for anyone who's ever been told their voice doesn't matter. This is proof that it does. I didn't shout. I didn't have to. The quiet truth of my words was louder than any accusation. I gave a small nod, handed back the microphone, and left the stage as the applause swelled again. Then, the bidding began. It was immediate, fierce. The auctioneer's voice rose like a chant, numbers escalating so fast they made my head spin. 10,000, 20, 40. With every bid, the atmosphere shifted, like gravity itself was changing. I watched my family. The shock on their faces had curdled into full-blown panic. My father's hand gripped his water glass so tightly his knuckles turned white. My mother's mask of poise cracked wide open. She was frantically scanning the room, hearing the whispers, feeling the eyes of every person whose approval she had once weaponized. They weren't just witnessing my worthless passion receive value. They were watching the myth they built around me unravel in front of their entire social circle. They were losing control of the story they had spent a lifetime writing. When the gavel finally came down on a number that made me gasp, the room erupted in applause. I was suddenly surrounded. Congratulations, praise, outstretched hands. People who wouldn't have glanced at me a year ago now wanted my autograph. I was the center of the room's energy, the role they had always reserved for themselves. Through a gap in the crowd, I saw them moving, not with confidence, but desperation. Their polished exterior was gone. They looked like survivors clawing their way off a sinking ship, and then finally, they broke through the crowd. My father reached out, grabbed my arm. "Sarah," he said, my name sounding strange on his tongue, like a word he hadn't spoken in years. "We need to go. We need to talk. Now." His hand on my arm felt like a brand, a desperate attempt to reassert control. "We need to talk," he repeated, his voice tight with a panic I had never heard from him before. I looked at my mother, her face streaked with running mascara and disbelief. "Not here," I said, my voice colder and steadier than I ever imagined it could be. I gently removed his hand from my arm. A simple gesture, but it felt monumental. I wouldn't let them hijack my moment with a scene. I led them down a quiet hallway, away from the watching eyes and clinking glasses. The three of us stood under the harsh, clinical lighting, a pathetic, twisted version of a family reunion. "Sarah, we were so worried," my mother began, her voice trembling as she tried to play the wounded parent. "To disappear like that, a whole year without a word." The attempt to turn blame on me was so automatic, so familiar, it was almost impressive. "You told me to go," I said. Just 4 words, but they sliced through her performance like a blade. "I left, just like you asked." My father jumped in quickly, shifting tactics. "Look, what was said. It was heat of the moment stuff. We were pushing you, trying to make you stronger. And clearly," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the ballroom, "it worked. We always knew you had this talent." I looked at him, this stranger who wore my father's face, and let out a short, bitter laugh. "Pushed me?" I repeated, voice low and sharp. "You humiliated me. You disowned me. You called my work, my soul, worthless. You didn't push me. You tried to bury me. You just didn't realize I was a seed." Their faces fell. They had no response to that. They'd expected anger, maybe even tears, or a desperate gratitude for this sudden attention. They weren't prepared for calm. My father, ever the strategist, shifted again. "All right," he said, slipping into business mode. "What's done is done. You've clearly made a name for yourself. With your talent and our connections, think of what we could do together now." And there it was, the truth. They didn't miss me. They didn't regret what they'd done. They simply saw a valuable asset they had foolishly discarded. They weren't sorry for the wound. They were just stunned that a pearl had formed around it. "You don't want me back," I said, the realization settling over me like a soft, final curtain. "You just want access to my success. The girl you kicked out would have been thrilled by this belated attention. But she's gone. You made sure of that." I looked at their desperate, stunned faces one last time and felt only a distant pity. Then I turned and walked away, back toward the warmth and the music, leaving them behind in the cold silence of that hallway. I stepped back into the ballroom, back into the light. Clara and Maria found me instantly, their faces filled with pride and concern. They embraced me, and in that moment, I felt more belonging than I had ever known at my family's table. I looked around the room at the people who celebrated my work, who saw my worth without needing to weigh it like a ledger line, and I understood something with crystal clarity. Family isn't a prison you're born into. It's a garden you grow. It's made of people who water your roots when you're wilting, who cheer for your blooms, who never ask you to shrink to fit in a smaller pot. My family wasn't the one I had just walked away from. It was the one I'd been building all along. The true victory that night wasn't the incredible sum announced by the auctioneer. It wasn't the applause or the praise. It had happened a year ago, in a lonely motel room, when I decided not to give up. It happened with every late-night diner shift that paid for paint, with every sketch that pulled me out of the dark. This public triumph was only the echo of a deeply private battle, for my soul, for my voice. My parents had spent my life teaching me something brutal but valuable. You will never be good enough for people committed to misunderstanding you. Their attempt to reclaim me wasn't love, it was greed. They didn't want me. They wanted what they had thrown away, now that others had seen its worth. I used to think I was the black sheep, the broken one. But I see it now. Maybe the black sheep is just the one brave enough not to be dyed to match. The one who leaves the flock to find a pasture where they can finally breathe. My story isn't about revenge. It's about liberation. It's about the messy, painful, beautiful process of saving yourself. I left their story so I could start writing my own. And as I stand here today, I want to ask you, have you ever had to walk away from everything you knew just to find out who you really are? Tell me your story in the comments. Because anyone who's ever felt like an outsider deserves to know they're not alone on the journey to find their way home to themselves.